we're going to bring Courtney Brown on, and let's see here. We're going to talk about the Pheonix Lights. He is the man behind the Farsight Institute, and they remote view, and he'll tell you more about it, because I'm looking and I seem to have lost I've lost the bio, but but he's no stranger to the show, so that's like Nori having on Hoagland or something. All right,
frequent flyer.
Yeah, so here we go. All right, Courtney Brown joining us here on Late Night in the Midlands. Good evening, Courtney. How are you?
Hey, Michael. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you just fine, and I thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about the Pheonix Lights.
Yeah, that's great. Are we live now, or are we waiting?
Yes, sir. We are live. And
oh, that's great. Okay, well, it's great to be here, Michael. I want to thank you so much for inviting me back.
Oh, absolutely. I watched the Pheonix Lights documentary of yours today. I watched the full thing, and wow, fascinating. So what I'd like to do is just a brief background on yourself, for we have new affiliates tonight. So
okay.
Yeah. So if we could start there, and then let's go into the remote viewing of the Pheonix Lights.
Super. Well, I'm Courtney Brown, and I'm the director of the Farsight Institute. That's www.farsight, Farsight, like seeing far.org. ORG, because we're a nonprofit. And we're the largest scientific place anywhere, the biggest, the best, whatever you can say, that focuses on the study of the remote viewing phenomenon as it is done using the military or military-derived methodologies that were developed by the United States military and used for espionage purposes. And I can say that we're the biggest, the best, because we're the only. There is no other place that you can find these large public experiments where people can follow the data collection procedures, as well as the projects we do, as well as a huge wealth of educational materials, and so on. So for those of your listeners who are new, remote viewing is a mental process. Some of your listeners may think of it as psychic. We don't use that word, but it's a function of mental transference of information across time and space in complete violation of the mainstream accepted laws of physics, of quantum mechanics, and relativistic physics. But your listeners who are new should recognize that those laws are over 100 years old in their fundamentals. Nothing has changed in over 100 years in those. And that new theories of physics are emerging that do account and do allow for the remote viewing phenomenon to occur. So the classical interpretation of quantum mechanics is simply incorrect, and similarly with relativistic physics. Now, I'm a mathematician, but the math is not in dispute in quantum mechanics or in relativistic physics. The math is perfectly okay. It's the interpretation that's in dispute. And basically that goes back to a dissertation that was written by Hugh Everett, who wrote his dissertation at Princeton University, and he had an interpretation of a quantum mechanical experiment called the two-slit experiment that was radical in its day, but it basically had an understanding that there are other realities or other parallel timelines, that we live in a frequency-based universe, and that the classical interpretation of quantum mechanics, that everything is just one, there's just one unique version of us, and that mass is solid as we have it, as we see it, is just simply wrong. And that interpretation was widely laughed at in his day, but today about 18% of mainstream physicists have adopted that other world's interpretation, the Hugh Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics, which allows for a generalization of quantum mechanics to the macro world, which then allows for the remote viewing phenomenon to be understood. So it's mental transference of information, and we work at the Farsight Institute with the absolute best remote viewers who use these military or military-derived methodologies that were used for espionage, but now used for scientific purposes. And these viewers are scary good. They have trained for way over 10, 15 years, going on 20, and they're the best on the planet. And they can describe things across time and space with a level of accuracy that is superior to that which would be achieved if they were physically present and watching things with their own eyes. And they do it with under a condition that's known as working blind, meaning they are given no information at all about what the thing is that they're supposed to perceive, which is the target. And that can be people, places, events, whatever. Yet they are able to describe those things in perfect detail, which is why the military was interested in the phenomenon in the first place. It allowed them to use it for spying without having the risk of having a spy get caught.
And I got a question about that. My wife and I both were curious. Okay, so they're not told anything about the project. Then how exactly do they know or what they're supposed to be? I mean, how do they get onto? I mean, you want them to remote view the Pheonix lights, so how did they wind up doing that? If they
this is actually not well understood among many people who do practice remote viewing out there, but it's an old finding for us. It's not in dispute. We know exactly how it works, but there's a lot of misunderstanding out there. The basic idea is remote viewing works with the principle of telepathy, meaning there is a mental connection between the person who's doing the remote viewing, that would be the remote viewer, and the person who is analyzing the remote viewing data for the first time. That means the person who's comparing those data to the target. We can call that person the analyst. And so the remote viewer is doing this session for the purpose of satisfying the informational needs of that analyst. That's why the remote viewer is doing it. So that mental connection that exists between the remote viewer at one point in time and the analyst sometime in the future, when their analyst is looking at the data and comparing it to the target, is what makes the target a target. It's the analyst's thoughts at the time that the target is being reviewed with the data, compared with the data. The thoughts of the analyst are acting like a laser pointer to point the consciousness, the focus of perception of the remote viewer to that spot. This was actually discovered sort of accidentally, but through an interesting experiment that was developed back in the 1980s, actually dating back as far as the 70s, but mostly the 80s, where there was an experiment that was fatally flawed in its design, but nonetheless had a result that was really interesting. There would be, you can call it a pick a target out of 5. And so there were 5 things that were possible targets. One was real, and the other 4 were decoys. And the real target was picked by some dynamic device, such as a random number generator or a computer. Now, the remote viewing data would be supposed to be perceiving the correct target as chosen by the computer. And the data would be given to the analysts, who would be blind. They would not be knowing which was the correct and which were the decoys. So the analysts would be looking at the data and comparing it with all 5 targets and seeing which one matched. And you had a very unusual phenomenon occurred. You had something that some people called the switch session phenomenon, or the displace target phenomenon, where the remote viewing session would be a really good description, but of one of the decoy targets. It was of the wrong target, not the one that the computer picked. Well, we spent close to 10 years investigating that. It was an obsession for me until we finally figured out what was going on. What was happening was that there was a mental connection between the remote viewer and the analysts who were comparing the data to the targets. And the analysts had all 5 targets on their mind. They were looking at all 5 targets and comparing those with the data. So you were going to get some targets that were being described that were the so-called incorrect targets, because that's what that's what the analysts were thinking. And so this phenomenon was addressed in the early remote viewing literature statistically, because the people that were trained to look at remote viewing, to do remote viewing in the early days, were trained in statistics. So what they did was they came up with a statistical method to account for the non-independence across the target pool. And they developed a procedure called the stacking procedure. And that was absolutely ridiculous because it addressed an informational leak using a statistical approach. That's like saying your bridge is wobbling. So let's analyze the bridge and apply some mathematics to get rid of the wobble in our data that's showing up on our oscilloscope. Well, the bridge is going to fall down, for heaven's sake. If you don't fix it, don't get rid of the data. I mean, don't eliminate the wobble on the oscilloscope. Fix the bridge. So unfortunately, fortunately for us, because it gave us a problem to solve, but the statistical approach was ludicrous. There was an informational leak in the experimental design, which fatally flawed the collection of the data. It actually corrupted the collection of the data. And once we figured that out, it allowed us to fix it in our experimental designs. And we certainly don't use that early experimental design. I don't know anybody that still uses that experimental design because it really is fundamentally flawed. But nonetheless, that was the really great experimental design that led us to the understanding of the problem in the first place. And so we're very grateful for the people who were doing that early design because it led us to an understanding of what was going on. And so the thoughts of the analysts actually create the focus of perception. In the early experiments, it didn't matter what target the computer picked. The computer was completely irrelevant to the entire process. What mattered was the thoughts of the analysts. Now, on a statistical basis, they actually had statistical significance of over many targets, over many experiments, and they used that to say that psi functioning or remote viewing was working, but they basically ignored the fact that some of the targets were incorrectly described really well. And so the reason the statistical significance happened is that there was a little more intellectual or mental focus on the result that came out at the end after it was revealed to them that the computer chose target whatever. Then they'd focus on that a little bit more. So over time, there was a little bit of extra emphasis on the so-called correct target. So they got their statistical significance, but they never figured out what the problem of the experiment was. And that's one of the great early results of Farsight, that we figured out that one. That was one of our most important contributions intellectually to this entire field, figuring out what makes a target a target. So your question, Michael, is really, really good.
Well, thank you. I was just, I've been wondering it, and the last couple times you were on, I absolutely forgot to even ask you about it. So, good, we got that done. Now, again, it was fascinating, and I don't know how much you want to reveal tonight.
We don't have any breaks, because the thing is that the remote viewing that's done in the DVD or in the video on demand, however people want to look at it, is recorded live on video. So even if we talk about it, it doesn't take away from it at all. You have to see it to believe it. The remote viewing, as it's coming through with the remote viewers, recorded live on video under totally blind conditions. The remote viewers are not told anything. They're given an email from me that's totally non-leading that simply says there is a target, remote view it, send me the sessions. So we do all of our sessions now on video, live, and I have never, ever heard anybody ever say that the remote viewing, when it's recorded live, is anything other than absolute spine tingling. I mean, you're literally on the edge of your seat, because you as the audience know what the target is, because you're watching it, you're watching the video, but it's clear that the remote viewers do not know what the target is, and that they're piecing it together. And the descriptions are so scary good in accuracy and scary good in describing the so-called verifiable elements of the targets, which is the things we know to be true, that it just keeps you on the edge of your seat and your jaw drops to the bottom of the ground. I mean, it's an unbelievable experience to watch these. And we have so many of these projects that we've done that it's not like it's just one or two. If anyone has any real doubts about the remote viewing phenomenon, just watch them. I mean, there's no possible way you could have doubt after watching them over and over after watching one after the other with these remote viewers who are really the very best. Now, when we say these are the very best, it's like playing the piano. I don't know if you're a great pianist, but I'm just assuming that you know how to make some noise on the piano, just like I know how to make some noise on the piano. But if we want to go hear the piano as we know it can be done, the best, we listen to somebody like Lang Lang play it at Carnegie Hall. And when you hear Lang Lang play it at Carnegie Hall, you say, oh, so that's what it's all about. That's what can be done with this thing called a piano. Well, that's what the remote viewing phenomenon is. A lot of people, everybody has intuitions and psychic perceptions. But to see it done on a level that's scary good, you watch these remote viewers live on video. And their names in this particular project are Jazz Smith, who works out at the UK, using a set of procedures known as CRV, and those procedures came out of an official military program that was housed in the Defense Intelligence Agency that was officially closed in November of 1995, but everyone I know and respect understands that the thing was reopened right away afterwards, and the remote viewing projects in the U.S. military are now much bigger than they were back in those days. And then the other remote viewer that works in this project is Dick Allgaier, and he works out in Hawaii using procedures that are known as the HRVG methodology. That's for the Hawaii Remote Viewers Guild, and that was taught to him by Glenn Wheaton. Glenn Wheaton came out of Special Forces intelligence, and something that was best thought of as a movement, a non-official program, but a movement within the military that later became known as the 1st Earth Battalion, that was featured in the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats, starring George Clooney and Jeff Bridges. So you have two different branches of Army intelligence and two different styles of remote viewing, both working within the Pheonix Lights project and many of our other projects. And it's fascinating to actually watch them do it. You don't have to know anything about the methodologies to understand what they're doing with the remote viewing on video.
Well, it is fascinating, and I'll tell you, I'm glued to it. And it's so fascinating that what they say later on about the stars and such, I find even more incredible, and it almost makes sense to me.
You're talking about the very surprising for this project extraterrestrial interaction that Dick Allgaier actually had, a direct communication with one of the extraterrestrials in the Pheonix Lights ship.
Oh yeah. And
that was really surprising, because these remote viewers are trained to go in and describe the target. Having them actually enter into a conversation with one of the extraterrestrials is not normal. It's not expected, because they don't know what the target is. But in that particular case, Dick Allgaier was remote viewing he was getting the exact same data that Jazz Smith got. It was like carbon copy stuff. And they were working on opposite ends of the planet, and absolutely no communication between them during the entire remote viewing phase of the project. And the only real difference is that when Dick Allgaier and Jazz Smith were describing this tall guy that seemed to be in charge of one of the ships, he had a lot of shorter helpers around him. They both described the same person similarly. I mean, incredibly similarly, identically. But Dick Allgaier got really close to his face, just a few inches away, in his remote viewing persona, and the extraterrestrial saw him. Now that's very unusual. Now, humans, we know this for an absolute fact. Humans cannot tell that they are being remote viewed, meaning when someone is remote viewing somebody else, another human, never is the remote viewer perceived by the human. So never. Now, if someone in your audience says that's not true, some people who are very sensitive can say, nobody, first of all, nobody remote views random people like your neighbor, because to do remote viewing, you have to actually have a project set up. It's a very expensive deal. It's a very complicated process. Nobody uses such a thing for looking at their neighbors. I mean, it's a huge investment in time and energy. And the people that do remote viewing only do it for very serious scientific projects with a lot of preparation and the whole stuff like that. So it's impossible for it to be used for casual. What's that when you what's the word that you use for looking in, peeping in on neighbors, like if you're looking through? Yeah, but casual voyeurism. It's impossible for it to be done for casual voyeurism, period. So when you hear people say that that's not true, they perceived remote viewers perceiving them, they're just, I'm not insulting them, but it's delusional. They have never perceived remote viewers looking at them, because never has a remote viewer ever looked at them in the first place. It's not possible for remote viewers to spend their time doing that. It's way too difficult to do. So just on the level of did it ever happen, I guarantee it's never happened. But there have been, but also on the level of when we do remote view other humans in official projects, either the military or at Farsight or whatever, like if you're at the military where it's remote viewing a Russian spy base or something in the or some other type of terrorist activity or whatever. Well, the remote viewers go to a location, perceive things. Never, ever do the humans at those locations turn around and look in the direction of the remote viewers. Period. It's never happened. However, extraterrestrials, some advanced extraterrestrial species, that's not the case. With some advanced extraterrestrial species, they can tell automatically. They're like genetically capable of doing that. They can see the remote viewers sort of vestige, sort of some type of whatever the remote viewers leave at the target site, like a ghostly image. They can see it, and they actually can turn right in the direction. This has been known for a very long time, that some extraterrestrials can see a remote viewer immediately and engage in a conversation if they want. For example, in Ingo Swann's book Penetration, there was an instance where the military had been at a secret location, had him remote view an extraterrestrial base on the moon without telling Ingo Swann that was the target. And Ingo was like really flipped out when he said, "This is the moon. What are those people doing over there?" And the people, the extraterrestrials there, turned right around and started pointing at him where his focus of perception was. And then the military people who were in the room, the military person, the so-called monitor, did something that in today's day and age was like we call really absolutely ridiculous. But in that day and age, it was understandable. He said, pull out. We don't want to be seen. Get out of there." But the extraterrestrials could see him. And so we've actually known this for a very long time. But in the Pheonix Lights experiment, in none of our experiments do we try to have that happen. So in the Pheonix Lights experiment, we had a situation where Dick Algar simply got really close to this guy and started describing the shape of the pupils of his eye, like the shape of pupils were like a cat. And so he got really close, they both, Daz Smith and Dick Algar, described the guy's hair, face, and things like that. But Dick Algar got really close, and then the guy just started to talk with him. He just started to say, "Well, since you're here, I'll give you some information." And then Dick just kept on saying, "Well, this is what the guy's saying. He's saying this," and so he just reported on back. So what was so interesting about this, now this was not planned because we never plan on a communication. What we plan on is passive, go out there, perceive what's there, and report back. We don't ever have part of the problem or part of the tasking be to get into a conversation with who's ever out there. But in that case, it just happened by accident. And Dick Algar reported it. And it was interesting in particular because that meant that in 1997, when this event was taking place, that's the important thing to remember. This thing took place on Thursday, the 13th of March in 1997. The extraterrestrials in that spacecraft above Phoenix knew full well that they were putting on a light show for the people down below. But they also knew that simultaneously they were explaining what they were doing to people in 2015. So there was a time loop going on. There was a triangle. People on the ground, people in the ship, and humans in 2015. And the extraterrestrials knew full well that they were having a communication with people in 2015 to explain what was happening to the people on the ground in 1997. Now, you have to understand that the Pheonix Lights experiment is a little different for us in another way also. Normally, we start with things that have hugely verifiable components based on physical evidence, in the sense that we normally have a picture, like in our last three and the previous two projects dealing with extraterrestrials. Normally we have never actually dealt with just extraterrestrial type targets before, but the last three we did, and that was sort of fun, something new for us. And with regard to the Cydonia Mars target, the so-called face on Mars target, as well as the aliens on Iapetus, a facility that's on Iapetus, we're dealing with pictures that are supplied by NASA. And we have very clear, verifiable components in those targets that we can see in the pictures. We know exactly what the terrain is like. Iapetus is a barren, icy moon with craters, and the target is exactly in the middle of a crater, on the wall of a crater. I mean, all that stuff is verifiable, and the remote viewers have to describe it spot on. And they do. Pheonix Lights is different because there's very little photographic evidence of it. There's a few videos that were taken, and there's some stills that were taken, but they were taken by private individuals. There's no official governmental release of the thing. So this is a little different from us, but the reason we could do the project in the first place is because it was witnessed by people in 5 states. That includes Sonora, Mexico, and 4 states in the American Southwest, and over a period of a number of hours, and for basically over a 2-hour period, they settled in over Phoenix. And so you had these lights over Phoenix. Now, the lights themselves were connected to the craft, a ship that was clearly visible by tens of thousands, verifiably, tens of thousands of people in Phoenix, potentially hundreds of thousands over the 5-state area, but over Phoenix, tens of thousands of people. And that included the governor of the state, Fife Symington, who was a former Air Force officer, a pilot, and he was the governor of the state. And he said point blank that he knows every machine that flies, and this was bigger than anything. And the thing was flying really low, and you could see the underbelly of the ship, and that the lights were connected to it. And it was so big, it was blocking out the sky above and the stars. So the government was silent for 6 months after the event. And after 6 months, they had a flight lieutenant come out and say, oh, that was just some flares that we dropped. Well, even the governor of the state, Fife Symington, said, those weren't flares. I mean, flares don't fly in formation, and let alone over 5 states. And they don't hang around for a couple hours right overhead. And they're not connected to the underbelly of a ship that you can see. So, I mean, the official governmental story doesn't match with what people saw, and we had tens of thousands of people in Phoenix see it. So that was enough for us in terms of verifiable components to have a desert city in Phoenix, hundreds of thousands of people on the ground, tens of thousands looking up at this thing, lots of very high-profile eyewitnesses, including the governor of the state, a lot of safety people, firemen, police officers, things like that. So with all those witnesses, it was a project that was sort of waiting for us to happen, especially since the governmental story of what happened was so nutty. it was a perfect type of mystery for us to go in and say, well, this is what really happened. So under totally blind conditions, we sent the best remote viewers on the planet to see, and the government story of flares did not win. But we got some real interesting surprises in the package. And when you see the video with Dick Elgar in particular having a conversation, that's such a thing. That just doesn't happen.
It's incredible, Courtney. I mean, for me, I'm a believer. There was a time where I was a little skeptical, but I've seen enough now where it's been proven to me. Maybe not others, that's their business, but for me, I believe in this. And the conversation that he had with this extraterrestrial was, I don't know how else to say, but fascinating.
Yeah, that's why we do these things on video now. Because, Michael, your sort of skepticism in the beginning was understandable, because in the old days, in the military days, and in the early Farsight days, everybody did remote viewing with paper and pen. And to be quite honest, nobody likes to look at paper and pen. No one likes to look at pieces of paper, especially when you're trying to demonstrate that information transference across time and space is possible. I mean, just scribbles on a piece of paper, just don't do it. But when you see it done live on video by these world-class remote viewers, that changes everything. That's a complete game changer in terms of what's possible. So that's really what this is all about. Having the planet change, having the entire species, all of humanity change because of a fundamental recognition that this type of thing is real. It's really a very exciting time to be alive right now, because we're on the cusp of a tremendous fallout of mainstream ideas and the replacement of those nutty ideas with something different that's really very different, that will really help explain to people who we are as a species, who we are as individuals, why we're here, what we're doing in here. It's really a time of great potential for us.
It really, truly is. And what I got, the part of the conversation that really hit home with me is when he was told by this extraterrestrial that don't look at looking at the universe, I guess, in a 3D fashion is kind of like looking at the Earth as being flat. And I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, actually, that's very important. That's a concept that has been around for a very, very long time. There's a book called the Flatlanders, and it's the idea of the whole idea of the book, the Flatlanders, is that people living in a, let me talk mathematics for a little bit. Okay. There's also a band, by the way, called the Flatlanders. So anyway, in fact, the piece of literature that I'm talking about is actually not a book. It's a short story. But nonetheless, it's a very interesting story. And the idea behind it is that you can have a two-dimensional surface. Think of a flat surface like a piece of paper. But that flat surface is located in a three-dimensional space. And so if you're on the flat surface, you don't even know that the three-dimensional space is even there. For example, let us say you're on a balloon and you're an ant, and you're walking on the surface of the balloon. Well, as far as you're concerned, the surface of the balloon is all there is. You don't know that there's air below you, and as far as you're concerned, everything is a two-dimensional universe. And you don't know that you could go through the balloon and get to the other side and there's another dimension, because you're just seeing the flat surface of it. So that's the idea of Flatlanders. And the idea that the extraterrestrial was communicating to Dick Elgar, that's similar to that. is that we humans don't understand that the three-dimensional space that we live in plus time is not all there is. Now, in physics, they refer to this three-dimensional space plus time as Minkowski space. So when we say Minkowski space, we're just talking about 3 dimensions plus time. But the extraterrestrial is saying that Minkowski space is not all there is. There's other dimensions. And that, from a mathematical point of view, is very easy to understand. And if you have other dimensions, then you are able to go from one spot in Minkowski space to another spot in Minkowski space, say from one star system to another star system, without having to travel in the normal way. For example, if you're on the balloon and you're an ant, if you want to get from one side of the balloon to the other, you have to think in terms of walking around the entire balloon. Well, if that ant understood three-dimensional space, then the ant could go right through the balloon and have a shortcut and come out the other side. So that's the essential element that the extraterrestrial was explaining, that there's more dimensions than just the ones that we think of in Minkowski space. And he translated it to what we talk about with star systems. And when we look in the sky, we just think of stars as balls of light that are created by fusion atomic processes, and they're spewing energy out in the form of heat and light and subatomic particles and so on. And the extraterrestrial said, but that's not actually what's going on. What you actually have with a star is like a hole in space, and you have energy from those other dimensions coming through that hole in space. And that's where, so that's that other realm is what they utilize for transportation, and they get faster than light travel, which is how they were there. Anyway, so that was a very interesting sort of physics lecture to come from the extraterrestrial, but it was very interesting also because it blended with concepts that we do understand now in terms of dimensional surfaces that are placed within larger dimensional spaces. Actually, if you want to know some of the names for that, a plane, such as a piece of paper or a balloon, those are things called hyperspaces. Hyper, like someone is really hyper, but a hyperspace. And a hyperspace is something that they refer to as an n-1 dimensional space. And what that means is if you have a three-dimensional space and you're looking at something one dimension less, which is a two-dimensional thing, you have a plane. But the plane is located in a three-dimensional space. So a balloon is a two-dimensional thing. It's just a surface that has just two dimensions, but it's located within a three-dimensional space. And so we have a universe, and our universe that we call Minkowski space is actually a hyperspace because it's embedded within a larger dimensional space, and that's what the extraterrestrial was referring to. And it's sort of fascinating to sort of, you see, I am a mathematician. I'm a mathematician that works in the social science program at a major university, but the mathematics and none of any of this is not in dispute. The only thing that is in dispute is the interpretation. We're making advances in the quantum mechanical and relativistic realms all the time, but we do quantum computing now. We understand entanglement a lot better, but the issue is the interpretation of the fundamental quantum mechanical phenomena is just simply, it dates back over 100 years, and it's really not changed. The only thing that's actually changed in the interpretation, in the early days, they had what they called the Copenhagen interpretation of the quantum mechanical phenomena, where basically you have everything existing in a probabilistic state until it's observed in some way, and then that pops it out, and you have one reality that's in front of us, and that's it. And, it was Hugh Everett that said, that's monstrous, that's crazy. But nonetheless, that was back in 1957, and he used the word monstrous. But the only real change that's happened in that Copenhagen interpretation is that they've blended it with relativity to be able to talk about the standard model. But other than that, it's the same. It's over 100 years old. It's dated. It's as monstrous as it is incorrect. The interpretation is the only thing in dispute. No one's questioning the mathematics. The mathematics are still the same. Even when Hugh Everett wrote his dissertation, no one was questioning his mathematics. It was the interpretation that they were questioning, and it was a political battle at the time. To be quite honest, that's what it was.
So basically, Courtney, if when we're looking into the night sky and we're seeing all these stars in space, then what we're actually seeing is holes in the space and time.
Yes, that's exactly what you're seeing.
And so we're actually not seeing a burning star. We're seeing into another dimension.
Yes, that's exactly what you're seeing.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah, you're seeing stuff come out from another dimension. That's exactly that's exactly what you're seeing.
So how would that fit into as far as like the idea of the Big Bang theory and all that kind of stuff is concerned? Would it
would be the same. It would be the same. No,
right.
It's the same exact thing. That means that the Big Bang would have occurred with the same principle that the stars that you see today are occurring, meaning that in a point there was an emergence of energy from a larger dimensional realm, producing a hypersurface, which is all the universe that you see and I see. But what we do when we see stars, we're seeing many Big Bangs. We're seeing many or small windows into that other realm. And that other realm is the same realm from which everything came in the first place.
So that other realm is essentially a huge array of energy.
Yes,
basically.
It's whatever it is, it's huge, and it contains our entire universe. And the Big Bang does not question the Big Bang. It just says when you're looking at a star, you're actually looking at the same principle that you were looking at when you had the Big Bang. And when you see energy coming out of that point that you call a star, well, that's how the universe started. It was a point, and a huge amount of energy came out, and it exploded and expanded, and here we are, Michael. So this was revolutionary thinking in terms of interpreting. So the Big Bang is really, well, actually, it is in dispute. A lot of people question the Big Bang, but it is the dominant theory that's taught in the university, even though there's a lot of arguments among physicists about whether it's correct or not. But nonetheless, it is the dominant thing. But what this extraterrestrial was explaining is that this basic idea that we have with the Big Bang is really fundamental to every star we're seeing. And there's this other larger multidimensional realm of which our Minkowski space is a subset, is a smaller thing. I mean, and this then has to be connected with the quantum mechanical stuff of Hugh Everett. By the way, Hugh Everett studied under John Wheeler at Princeton, and when Hugh Everett came, and John Wheeler was basically, he was a great physicist in his day, but he was raised in the time of the Copenhagen interpretation with the original people, such as with Bohr, and actually that was in Einstein's day as well, and as well as Heisenberg and others. And so the idea of challenging those theories when the originators of those theories were still around was really, really tough. And so Hugh Everett basically was laughed at, he was mocked, and he had to leave physics. Well, he didn't have to, but he did leave physics. Maybe he had to. I'm not sure how his job prospects would have been, but he ended up working in the Defense Department in the nuclear program, and he was one of the prime architects of the principle of MAD, M-A-D, which is mutually assured defense, which is mutually assured destruction, which basically said the Chinese and the Russia and the Soviets could make their missiles and point them at us, and we would make our missiles and point them at them, and nobody would shoot because everybody would die if that happens. So Hugh Everett was the one who designed that, and that was lucky because back in those days there were people in the military as well in the civilian realm who were actually very well placed. They were in the White House. They were, people that worked. That they weren't presidents, but they worked in the White House. They were also people that were high-ranking in the military. We're talking very senior people in the military who were actually arguing in favor of a first strike, very similar to the movie Dr. Strangelove with Peter Sellers. And it was Hugh Everett, believe it or not, that really stopped that argument. They were actually, can you imagine what would have happened if they actually did it? Which is, like the way to stop the Russians and the Soviets and the Chinese was to strike them first. That would have been a complete Armageddon, and America would have gone down in, well, I guess there would have been no history books because we'd all be dead. But if there were history books, America would have gone down similar or much worse than Hitler, Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun. I mean, it would have been the worst possible thing. So Hugh Everett really saved us to be able to talk about it to this day. And so, he was a brilliant man, but now about 18% of mainstream physicists have actually adopted his other worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which allows for a generalization of quantum mechanics to the macro world, which means that 82% still cling to the old Copenhagen interpretation.
Yeah.
But those are older people, and we're waiting for them to go through generational replacement. They're going to retire and die off. So the 18% are younger people, and so there'll be a change. So, sometimes these ideas take a while, but they eventually do happen. And so that's what we're looking for. And so with an other worlds interpretation or many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, you actually can see a way that the remote viewing actually works.
Right. And
So-
Courtney, I would say this to people who think it's far-fetched. These stars, they could lead to other dimensions and other areas of space. And people who think that's funny, I direct you to the pictures of all these large crafts that have been photographed around our sun.
I was going to
Yeah.
bring that up, Michael. Yes, very good point. Exactly what I was going to bring up. There's so many different videos and images showing these different craft going into and out of stars and volcanoes and on and on and on. And it would really lead right to this being an explanation of that.
Actually, what we have now is official governmental denial of the extraterrestrial UFO phenomenon. But among people who know, including within the government, there really is, it's not in dispute at all. I have been in rooms with two-star generals on down where the extraterrestrial content or their extraterrestrials are simply talked about like you and I are talking about the price of milk at the store. They're not doubting it at all. And so when you say, well, look, here we are sitting in a room with colonels, two-star generals, and stuff like that, and you say, what if I go out and tell everybody? And they'll just look at you straight in the face and say, go ahead, tell. I'll just deny it, and you'll look like a fool. So, it's not a situation where the government is ready to sort of force people to accept the existence of extraterrestrials or remote viewing. But there has been a change, and the government is no longer forcefully trying to debunk or forcefully trying to disrupt groups that do believe or do study this phenomenon, this stuff, the extraterrestrial phenomenon. Because in the old days, and that goes all the way up into the early 2000s, but certainly through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, the government was very active in disrupting groups that would be focusing on things like remote viewing or things especially like UFOs, extraterrestrials. They typically would do it by infiltrating the groups one at a time with people, and those people would typically cause problems. They'd become valued people within the group, but then they'd create dissent or discord, and the groups would end up fragmenting, and people would walk away in disgust, and no one would ever know the difference. So they had other methods, but that was one of the many methods that they used. And the idea was always to keep the groups small, fragmented, relegated to the New Age bookstore community, things like that, but not highly organized with a well-orchestrated media machine and so on. So basically, that has ended. The government is no longer actively trying to disrupt groups. It's letting people who want to find this information find out about it, to study it. But similarly, on the other hand, the government is not trying to force people who are not ready to accept it or to look at it or to understand it or to conceptualize it. It's not trying to force those people to accept the reality of extraterrestrial life, UFOs, remote viewing, or whatever. So it's letting people sort themselves out in their own way, but without an active element of disruption. So that's a change, and that's a good change. And now the people who are interested in this stuff can sort of study it and do it without disruption. But on the other hand, it still leaves a large number of people who voluntarily want to live in a state of denial, and that's a choice that they have. And who's to say what's the right thing to do in situations like that?
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to the Pheonix lights and the aliens basically who were interacting with us with that, do you think, or did they kind of reveal anything about whether or not they are having a real large direct interaction with us here on Earth, or is it
well
maybe
they clearly
that they are
they clearly are trying,
right? Okay,
that's why they showed up and hung around in the skies for over 2 hours. I mean,
I wonder if it's. I was just gonna say, I wonder if it's because they are trying to get maybe more people into thinking about them as opposed to.
They're trying to nudge. They're trying to nudge people. They're trying to push it, but they're not trying to force it. They're doing the same thing that the government's doing now, which is to try to let people who are ready to see it, to accept it, to move to the next level. But they're not trying to force it. They're not trying to land right in your backyard, grab you by the scruff of the neck, slap you around and say, "Wake up, you idiot. Can't you see a greater reality?" They're not trying to do that. The government is not trying to do that. Nobody's trying to do that. So, but they are obviously trying to nudge humanity in a better direction. That's why they invest. The extraterrestrials are investing a huge amount of time, energy, and resources in planet Earth right now, in humanity right now. So that's a big investment, and you don't have this type of investment just happen for nothing. I mean, it's a big deal. And similarly, when they were interacting with our remote viewers, they were taking their time out of that experience. They were not just interested in being a light show over Pheonix in 1997. They took the time out to very carefully choose what they were going to talk to or what they were going to say to those humans in 2015. So that was a very interesting thing. So that also tells you that they, by the very fact that they did interact with our remote viewers, that tells you that they highly valued what we were doing. And they didn't ignore us. They didn't say, "Oh, that's just some humans. How ridiculous. That's so stupid," and just ignore us. They stopped what they were doing. It was like they were waiting for us, and they had a message to give that was well thought out, prepackaged, and just what we needed to hear. It's sort of like the Matrix with the Oracle. And Morpheus asked Neo, "What did she say?" And no, actually, it was Neo who was wanting to tell Morpheus, and he said, "But this is what the Oracle told me." And then Morpheus would look at him and say, "She told you what you needed to hear." And so, that's what the extraterrestrials are doing. They're telling us what we needed to hear. And I guess what they felt we needed to hear was how the extraterrestrials could be here in the first place. That this idea of there being a larger dimensional space within which our Minkowski space is located was what we really needed to see, to hear, and understand.
Well, it actually makes a lot of sense to me, and and people constantly, even today, still, we're waiting on disclosure, waiting on the new. How much more disclosure do you need than a huge craft going across 5 states, seen by tens of thousands?
But Michael, just consider this. Despite the fact that there were potentially hundreds of thousands of witnesses and verifiably tens of thousands of witnesses, you still didn't get a planet Earth-shaking type of wake-up. You get 7 billion people, most of which are voluntarily staying in denial. It's just a gradual process. And I can only assume that the extraterrestrials sense that if they were to force it, it could produce some level of trauma, psychological trauma on the part of humanity, and they want to avoid that. I can only assume that's what's going on. So they're letting us wake up in our own way, but nudging us. And that's sort of, it's a very, I hate to go into music, but it's very Bob Marley-ish. Bob Marley was a reggae singer back in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, and part of the philosophy, spiritual philosophy that he promoted with his music was that people were essentially asleep within a system, and he called that system the Babylon system. And his role was to try to help people to awaken from that system and to be then fully sentient or fully alive beings. And his role was that of both a prophet and an awakener through his music. So he sort of approached the masses in a way that was very similar to the way the extraterrestrials are approaching humanity. Actually, you could say the same thing about Richard Wagner, because with Wagner in his so-called ring operas, he had a character called Siegfried, which was translated into Bob Marley's terms, the Rasta man. He was the one who saw no fear, felt no fear, and was fully awake. And it was his existence that led to the freeing of the rest of humanity. So, the idea of humanity being asleep is something that's been around for a very long period of time. The question is, how do you waken it up? And the extraterrestrials are playing a strategy that's very similar to a Bob Marley approach, which is not to grab humanity by the scruff of the neck and slap it around and say, "Wake up, you idiots," but to slowly nudge it into awakening.
Sort of like the seditionists of the universe.
Yeah, it's interesting. By the way, I should say, for those people of your audience who want to see the documentary, I encourage you to go to our website, which is www.farsight.org. That's FARSIGHT.org, O-R-G, because we're a nonprofit. And you can't miss it. It's right there, Pheonix Lights, right at the top, big banner. But anyway, it's available as a DVD as well as a video on demand with Vimeo, the DVD through Amazon. However, for everyone who does go to our website, please sign up for our free newsletter, because we are a nonprofit and we do not spend a dime on advertising. So we have no way of telling people what we're doing. So that is the only way we have to communicate with people, to let them know. So once a week we send out a newsletter, usually on Fridays. And if you just put your email address in there, and we never give out the email addresses for any purpose whatsoever, period, full stop, end of story. And so there's no spam concerns, and you'll hear from us once a week with regard to the things that we're doing. And we're doing an awful lot of stuff. So it's the best way to keep informed with what we're doing.
Well, Courtney, I highly recommend people, if you're interested in this kind of thing, and I don't know how you can't be, I recommend you do view this documentary. I did. It's fantastic. I mean, it's had me thinking all day. It's like I find it incredible. So, Courtney, I thank you so much for joining us here tonight and sharing that with us. Ira, did you have anything else?
Yeah, one other question I might have would be, did they give any indication as to whether or not what was seen with the Pheonix lights was the same type of craft that was spotted on the moon, for instance, over time, where there have been like these triangular shaped craft that have appeared there as well?
It had that signature type of shape, but we're not. I'm sure if there's one flying over Phoenix, I'm sure there's a zillion others. So. I'm sure we're not talking about the same craft, but it does seem to be a very common configuration.
Okay.
Sort of in the shape of a carpenter's square.
All right. Well, Courtney, again, thank you for spending some time with us. You keep putting them out there, and we'll keep having you back. I love talking about this stuff, but more importantly, I'm looking so forward to the day when one of those giant ships like that come and hover over my home for a while. I've seen a big one go by, but I've never seen one hang and hover.
Well, look, I want to thank you both for inviting me on your show again. I really enjoy coming here. You're really spectacular hosts. You really produce really great interviews. And I want all of your listeners to know that this type of subject matter is not yet covered by mainstream. And so if humanity is going to awaken, it is literally because of the efforts of people like Michael and Ira. And so this type of show, Late Night in the Midlands, is much more than just a show. It's literally the cutting edge of a planetary awakening. So I really want to thank you guys, and I want your listeners to know that by listening in, they're actually helping to change the planet in a fundamental way. They may be just thinking they're having a good time listening, but the reality is this is how a planet changes. This is how a species changes. And so big stuff is going on here, and I want to thank you for letting me participate.
Oh, thank you, Courtney. We wouldn't know about these things if it wasn't for guests like you. So thank you so much, and keep up the fantastic work, and we'll keep you linked up over on Late Night in the Midlands.
That's super. Thanks.
All right. Have a good night, Courtney.
Good night now.
All right, bye-bye. All right, everybody, there you have it. Courtney Brown.
But the math is not in dispute in quantum mechanics or in relativistic physics. The math is perfectly okay. It's the interpretation that's in dispute. And basically that goes back to a dissertation that was written by Hugh Everett, who wrote his dissertation at Princeton University. And he had an interpretation of a quantum mechanical experiment called the two-slit experiment that was radical in its day, but it basically had an understanding that there are other realities or other parallel timelines, that we live in a frequency-based universe, and that the classical interpretation of quantum mechanics, that everything is just one, there's just one unique version of us, and that mass is solid as we have it, as we see it, is just simply wrong. And that interpretation was widely laughed at in his day, but today about 18% of mainstream physicists have adopted that other world's interpretation, the Hugh Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics, which allows for a generalization of quantum mechanics to the macro world, which then allows for the remote viewing phenomenon to be understood. So it's mental transference of information, and we work at the Farsight Institute with the absolute best remote viewers who use these military or military-derived methodologies that were used for espionage, but now used for scientific purposes. And these viewers are scary good. They have trained for way over 10, 15 years, going on 20.
We're going to bring Courtney Brown on, and let's see here. We're going to talk about the Pheonix lights. He is the man behind the Farsight Institute, and they remote view, and he'll tell you more about it, because I'm looking and I seem to have lost I've lost the bio, but but you know, he's no stranger to the show, so that's like Nori having on Hoagland or something. All right,
frequent flyer.
Yeah, so here we go. All right, Courtney Brown joining us here on Late Night in the Midlands. Good evening, Courtney. How are you?
Hey, Michael. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you just fine, and I thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about the Pheonix Lights.
Yeah, that's great. Are we live now, or are we waiting?
Yes, sir. We are live. And
oh, that's great. Okay, well, it's great to be here, Michael. I want to thank you so much for inviting me back.
Oh, absolutely. I watched the Pheonix Lights documentary of yours today. I watched the full thing, and wow, fascinating. So what I'd like to do is just a brief background on yourself for we have new affiliates tonight. So
oh, okay.
Yeah. So if we could start there, and then let's go into the remote viewing of the Pheonix Lights.
Super. Well, I'm Courtney Brown, and I'm the director of the Farsight Institute, and they're the best on the planet, and they can describe things across time and space with a level of accuracy that is superior to that which would be achieved if they were physically present and watching things with their own eyes. And they do it with under a condition that's known as working blind, meaning they are given no information at all about what the thing is that they're supposed to perceive, which is the target, and that can be people, places, events, whatever. Yet they are able to describe those things in perfect detail, which is why the military was interested in the phenomenon in the first place. It allowed them to use it for spying without having the risk of having a spy get caught.
And I got a question about that. My wife and I both were curious. Okay, so they're not told anything about the project. Then how exactly do they know or what they're supposed to be? I mean, how do they get onto? I mean, you want them to remote view the Pheonix Lights, so how do they wind up doing that? If they
this is actually not well understood among many people who do practice remote viewing out there, but it's an old finding for us. It's not in dispute. We know exactly how it works, but there's a lot of misunderstanding out there. The basic idea is remote viewing works with the principle of telepathy, meaning there is a mental connection between the person who's doing the remote viewing, that would be the remote viewer, and the person who is analyzing the remote viewing data for the first time. That means the person who's comparing those data to the target. We can call that person the analyst. And so the remote viewer is doing this session for the purpose of satisfying the informational needs of that analyst. That's why the remote viewer is doing it. So that mental connection that exists between the remote viewer at one point in time and the analyst sometime in the future, when their analyst is looking at the data and comparing it to the target, is what makes the target a target. It's the analyst's thoughts at the time that the target is being reviewed with the data, compared with the data. The thoughts of the analyst are acting like a laser pointer to point the consciousness, the focus of perception of the remote viewer to that spot. This was actually discovered sort of accidentally, but through an interesting experiment that was developed back in the 1980s, actually dating back as far as the 70s, but mostly the 80s, where there was an experiment that was fatally flawed in its design, but nonetheless had a result that was really interesting. There would be, you can call it a pick a target out of 5. And so there were 5 things that were possible targets. One was real, and the other 4 were decoys. And the real target was picked by some dynamic device, such as a random number generator or a computer. Now, the remote viewing data would be supposed to be perceiving the correct target as chosen by the www.farsight.com. Farsight, F-A-R-S-I-G-H-T, like seeing far.org, O-R-G, because we're a nonprofit. And we're the largest scientific place anywhere, the biggest, the best, whatever you can say, that focuses on the study of the remote viewing phenomenon as it is done using the military or military-derived methodologies that were developed by the United States military and used for espionage purposes. And I can say that we're the biggest, the best, because we're the only. There is no other place that you can find these large public experiments where people can follow the data collection procedures, as well as the projects we do, as well as a huge wealth of educational materials, and so on. So for those of your listeners who are new, remote viewing is a mental process. Some of your listeners may think of it as psychic. We don't use that word, but it's a function of mental transference of information across time and space in apparent complete violation, actually in complete violation of the mainstream accepted laws of physics, of quantum mechanics, and relativistic physics. But your listeners who are new should recognize that those laws are over 100 years old in their fundamentals. Nothing has changed in over 100 years in those. And that new theories of physics are emerging that do account and do allow for the remote viewing phenomenon to occur. So the classical interpretation of quantum mechanics is simply incorrect, and similarly with relativistic physics. Now, I'm a mathematician,